Hello everybody. This is the second half of a two-part episode. We decided to split this one into two videos because it ended up being so long. If you haven't checked out the first half already, it is highly recommended that you watch or listen to that first before continuing with this one. The link to the first half will be in the description below. Otherwise, hope you enjoy the second part of this episode. Alright, so those were the Corvidian songbirds, and now we are going to look at the Passeridian songbirds, the group closer to sparrows than to crows. And this is another really big group that would take a while for us to get through. Yeah, let's have a look. So I've actually left out a lot of groups from this part of the tree, but just to give you a sense of some of these. First up, we have a group called the New Zealand wattlebirds, and they're so called because of these brightly colored wattles on their faces. The particular species that I pictured here is actually a recently extinct species called the huia, and the huia is really interesting because the males and the females have dramatically different beak shapes, and you can see that in the image here. So these are like mounted specimens. So the female has a much longer and more curved bill than the male does. So the one in the back is the female, and the one in front with the kind of the shorter, more chisel-like bill is the male. And it seems that they probably fed in very different ways. There was this idea that maybe they were cooperative feeders, like maybe the male would chip away like wood, and then that would allow the female to grab like whatever insects were underneath with her longer bill. But that doesn't seem to be the case as far as we know. It seems that it's more a case of segregated ecologies here. So basically the female feeds in a more probing fashion with a long bill, and whereas the male chisels with the bill to expose insects under bark. So yeah, interesting bit of like sexual niche partitioning in that species. Yeah, the New Zealand wattlebirds, I've seen them compared to like squirrels. Basically, they're kind of like squirrel birds, and the reason for that is because they hang out in the trees, but they don't fly a lot. They're at most they'll kind of like swoop from tree to tree, so like a little bit like a flying squirrel, I guess. So yeah, they're not very long distance flyers. Unfortunately, several of these New Zealand wattlebirds are recently extinct. One of them is a huia. There are three species that are still alive today. And there's a fourth that some people are hoping are still alive today, but hasn't been seen in a long time. So yeah, that's unfortunate. But again, hopefully we are able to conserve the remaining ones. Then we have a very weird group called the rockfowl, which is only known from two species from Africa. In fact, they were featured in the documentary Africa. These are a weird group of songbirds with like bald heads. They nest under rocky overhangs, so they'll like build a little mud nest underneath like they'll stick it to the surface of the rock. In the documentary Africa, you'll actually get a taste of like kind of the traditional view of songbird divergence times. They talk about how these Picathardes is the genus of rockfowl, have been around for like 50 million years or something, like just evolving on their own on this continent. And yeah, we don't really think that's the case anymore with the more recent date estimates. We think that songbirds in general originate much later, and so in turn the rockfowl are probably a more recent group. But nonetheless, they are a remarkable and very distinctive group of birds, and they're actually closely related to a few other weird groups too, like the rock jumpers that are also found in Africa, and a weird single species called the rail babbler from Southeast Asia. But probably their most unexpected cousins are the Australasian robins. And so this is a group that, as their name suggests, are found in Australasia. They were named Australasian robins because of their close resemblance to the European robin, which is also pictured on the slide here under the Muscicapidans. So, of course, as you can see on here, the Australasian robins are not that closely related to like European robins, but well, you know how things are with the Australian birds and their common names, and they do seem to do very similar things. They are similar in body shape. A lot of them do have like this bright reddish breast patch, and they are pretty territorial. They like the European robin, that they'll fend off intruders of their own kind pretty readily. And they mostly hang out near the ground or on the ground and catch small insects and things. So yeah, they do look and behave in a pretty similar way to the European robin. Um, then we have three big groups, and so one of these groups is a Sylvida, and then the next group is Muscicapida, and the next group is Passerida, and we will have to look at each of these groups in turn because each of them are very diverse on their own. But yeah, we can move on to the next slide. So first of all, let's look at the Sylvida. And the Sylvida includes a number of pretty familiar groups, at least to those of us who live in the temperate Europe or North America, like the tits. So the tits are a very familiar group. I think they're a pretty well-loved group of very active little birds, and they are quite remarkably tough, I think, considering their soft and cute and small appearance. A lot of them, they're not really migratory. They stick around in cold, harsh winters all year round, and are still able to survive despite that. They're able to like peck holes in trees. You might not expect that from their tiny little beaks, but they can peck holes in trees for nesting purposes. And some of them are actually quite predatory. So like the great tit, which is one of the largest species of tit, is kind of infamous for being able to kill smaller birds and bats. And in fact, a lot of the time what they'll do, especially during winter time when food is scarce, is they'll actually like peck holes into the head of these smaller birds and bats and feed on their brains, which is very nutritious but certainly rather gruesome behavior. And in case you weren't familiar, we do have tits in North America, but of course in North America we call them chickadees and titmice. So yeah, slightly different, but they're all part of the same group, all members of the tit group. And then we have the larks. The larks are a group that are another very widely distributed group, mostly found in very open habitats, and accordingly many of them are rather colored in these kind of light colored sandy brown tones that helps them hide in very open habitats. But they often engage in like pretty elaborate what we call song flight displays, and so they'll like fly high up into the sky while they're singing, and I guess that's a way for the males to show off their endurance. Like, look at me, I have enough energy to like fly high into the sky while I'm singing at the same time. That's pretty amazing, don't you think? So yeah, they're pretty well known for their songs. We have the swallows, which are probably one of the most distinctive groups of Sylviidans. They definitely look pretty different from everybody else, and they are specialized for swooping through the air. They have these long, pointed wings that allow them to turn very agilely through the air and capture insects by scooping them up in their very wide mouth. And I think swallows are probably pretty familiar to most people all over the world. And yeah, just for the record, swallows are not closely related to swifts. Yeah, swifts are members of Strysaures. They are closely related to hummingbirds, which we talked about in episode 5, whereas swallows are all the way over here in our final episode among the songbirds. So yeah, they are very different, even though they different types of bird, even though they behave in somewhat similar ways. There are some pretty easy ways to distinguish swallows from swifts if you see them out in the field. Like for one, swallows, if you see a swallow like bird like actually perch on like a wire or something or a branch, then it is probably a swallow and not a swift, because swifts, as we talked about back in the Strysaures episode, don't really like to perch like that. They prefer to cling to like vertical surfaces. But if you see something like perched like on a branch or a wire, that is probably a swallow. If you see something like landing on the ground voluntarily, that is probably a swallow. Swallows do still have like a pretty normal passeriform feet, so they can still walk around on the ground pretty well. In fact, they'll often do this to collect nesting material. A lot of them like to build nests out of mud, for example, so they'll land on the ground to collect it. And so if you see them land on the ground like that, yeah, that is probably a swallow. And if they are in flight, the wing shape of swallows and swifts looks pretty different. Like you can see in swifts, the wings are like very long and narrow and sickle shaped, whereas in the swallows they have a more triangular kind of shape. And so there are a number of ways you can tell them apart. I might add also that swifts tend to fly higher in the air than swallows do, so that's also a pretty good way to tell them apart. I've seen like swallows and swifts feeding in the same area, and there's a pretty obvious kind of segregation in the airspace that they occupy. Um,
That's cool.
yeah. So yeah, swallows are also lots of fun to watch. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. Um, and then we have a number of different groups like the cisticolas and the reed warblers and the grassbirds that have a very similar kind of general vibe to them, I guess. Like a lot of these are birds that live in like pretty open habitats, but usually these open habitats are places like tall grass or reeds. So they're often like hidden in the reeds and you'll only hear them. And yeah, it can be very frustrating for birders to just like have to stand there and try to figure out what they're listening to. If you can't recognize them by call and you have to wait for them to actually show themselves, like a lot of times you're kind of out of luck because yeah, they are very good at staying hidden. And after you catch a tiny glimpse of them as they kind of you see them kind of flit through the reeds or the grass, and then they're not even that brightly colored or anything, like not all that interesting visually, like these little brown birds. I think yeah, these birds are the bane of many birders, I suspect. But they are quite successful groups because these groups can be found all over Afro-Eurasia. Then we have a group called the bush tits. The bush tits, as their name suggests, are kind of similar to the true tits, but as you can see, they're quite distantly related to each other within Sylvida. The bush tits have longer tail feathers than the true tits do, and so they are also called the long-tailed tits. And in fact, the long-tailed tit is one of the most distinctive birds around here in the UK. Yeah, probably one of my favorite British birds. They're really cute. They look like fluffy ping pong balls with like long tails, and you see them flying around from tree to tree in little flocks, and yeah, they are mostly found in Eurasia, but there is one American species from Western North America, which is called the American bush tit, or sometimes just simply the bush tit, because it's the only one found in the Americas. They're often, people often like think of them as like one of the tits, but as you can see here, that they are really actually quite distantly related to them. Um, the bush tits are actually more closely related to the bush warblers, which are another group of those little brown birds that are more often heard than seen. Um, and then there are also the leaf warblers, which are somewhat in a similar vein. Leaf warblers are more often found in like treetops and things like that, feeding on insects. There are many species of leaf warblers, but they are hell to tell apart. um, yeah, they differ from each other. Like this one has slightly longer wing feathers. This one has a little bit more greenish feathers. This one has slightly reddish legs. This one sings a little bit of a different song. Things like that. Very minor details. So yeah, not easy. Big challenge for birders, that's for sure. Um, and then there's a final group on here called the Sylvioids, which is going to take another slide for us to get through. But before I jump there, I'll just mention that a lot of these groups of birds, a lot of the groups of birds here are called warblers. So the reed warblers, bush warblers, and the leaf warblers, and not only them, but also the cisticolas and the grass birds as well. Um, they all used to be lumped together in one big group called the Old World warblers. And so they're all these little these little brown birds that people mostly hear and look kind of drab, and they were all together considered like a single group, the Old World warblers. But of course, then we did the freaking genetic studies, and it turns out that turns out that they do not all form a group together. They are kind of scattered all around the tree within Sylvida. And in fact, there were some groups of birds that were considered members of this Old World warbler assemblage that weren't even members of Sylvida and were flung off far elsewhere. So yeah, it turns out that this was an old kind of wastebasket taxon, yeah, a bit like the traditional idea of the gruiforms, like we talked about in that episode. The gruiforms used to include a bunch of different groups of birds that turned out not to be so closely related to each other, and it's a similar story with the old world warblers. And so now we kind of split them up into all these separate groups, and yeah, but there is still kind of a core group of the Afro-Eurasian warblers. The the original bearer of the name Sylvia that the group was based on, and that is a group as a member of the Sylvioids. And so if we go to the next slide, we can see kind of where they fit into this phylogeny. And so the Sylvioids together I know a lot of researchers consider them the babbler group in the broad sense. So all of these birds can be considered babblers. So we mentioned earlier that there was a group called the Australasian babblers that are not closely related to this group, and so this is a group of, I guess, true babblers. And so among them, you have things like the bulbos. The bulbos are a very commonly seen group in Africa and Asia, especially in the tropics. They are often have these kind of rather bold color patterns. They feed mostly on fruits and insects and things, and live in small flocks. And yeah, they are in fact in Taiwan, for example, the most common wild bird is a species of a bulbul called the light-vented bulbul. So yeah, that's the most common bird you'll see there if you visit. And then we have the core group of Afro-Eurasian warblers, the ones that didn't get flung away out of the old warbler group. They are the Sylviids, and they're found all over Afro-Eurasia pretty much, and they have the general kind of warbler vibe. Insect eaters. They sing well, but not always the most colorful birds. A big surprise was that the Afro-Eurasian warblers are closely related to a group called the parrotbills, and they're a weird group of songbirds. You can see why they're called parrotbills because they have this really stout and thick-looking bill.
Yeah.
Yeah, they definitely use it to crack seeds open and things like that. Um, and so, yeah, the parrotbills, as it turns out, are actually very closely related to the Afro-Eurasian warblers, which we didn't really expect. And in fact, some taxonomic authorities consider both of these groups to be part of the same quote unquote family. So they call the Afro-Eurasian warblers and the parrotbills together all Sylviids. So yeah, whereas others split the parrotbills out probably because they look distinctive, I guess. But it
Mm.
doesn't really matter either way. But I do think it's pretty interesting that we found that the parrotbills are closely related to the Afro-Eurasian warblers. Also, something cool, there is one species of parrotbill that is found in North America. It is called the wren tit and is found in western North America. Now, it is not one of the parrotbills with this stout parrot-like bill. The bill is short, but it is more kind of narrow, so it looks more like the bill of a tit, for example. And well, that's probably where we got the name wren tit. So it's not a very flashy-looking bird. It's this brown bird that has long tail feathers. It looks a little bit like a bush tit, actually, but is actually a member of the parrotbill group, and it is the only member of the Sylvioids, actually, to be found in the Americas. So, if you have seen a wren tit, treasure that because you've seen something special. Um, but moving on, we have the white eyes. The white eyes are a group that's found in Afro-Eurasia and also Australasia and many of the Pacific Islands too. And most of them look pretty much like the one pictured here. They're little green birds with a white ring around the eye, and that's why they're called white eyes. But white eyes are of great interest to evolutionary biologists because they have been called what has been termed great speciators. So speciation, of course, is the process of the evolution of new species. Um, and because white eyes are so widely distributed across all these Pacific islands, they have evolved into many different species on these islands, and people have been interested in like how quickly like these species have evolved and what drives the evolution of these species for a long time. And there have been many studies on this, and something sort of a curious pattern among the white eyes that seems to help with this great speciator phenomenon is that they are capable of dispersing widely. Like they can cross oceans very easily for such small birds. But it seems that once they're established on an island, they kind of lose their wanderlust, basically. Like they stop flying to far places, and then they just stay there. And then, of course, since they stay there, it's very easy for them to kind of evolve in an independent path from their close relatives, and then become completely new species. So that's a really cool bit of evolutionary biology from the white eyes. And then we have three groups that are sort of the core groups of babblers. We have the tree babblers, the ground babblers, and the laughing thrushes. And the kind of tree babblers and ground babblers, they kind of have the ecologies you would expect for their names. So tree babblers primarily foraging in the trees, ground babblers primarily on the ground. Laughing thrushes are more diverse, so they're more varied in their habits, and they're a very successful group. Some of them are of particular interest to biologists who study social behavior, because there are a few species of laughing thrushes, like the Arabian babbler, for example, that that live in very complex family groups. They almost like meerkats, I guess. That might be the closest analogy that comes to mind. They live in these family groups where all the members of the group kind of help take care of the young, and like when they're foraging, they will there will be like individuals that adopt the sentry position to look out for danger and warn the others if there's danger. And furthermore, they also get into territorial disputes with like neighboring flocks of the same species, and they have all these like very elaborate kind of rituals for their combat and things. It's very complex, and some like the pioneering studies on like altruism in animals. So individuals helping other individuals, like what drives that kind of behavior, was done on Arabian babblers,
Yeah.
because they exhibit like altruistic behavior within the groups, and people have studied this and tried to figure out, oh, so well, why, what allows altruistic behavior to evolve, and that's all really fascinating. Of course, we don't have time to go into that here, unfortunately, but I do think it is worth highlighting, like these places where these birds have play a big role in helping us understand major evolutionary concepts. Um, all right. Do you have anything to add before we continue?
Not particularly, but I definitely will say that this is definitely one of those groups that I'm not well
Yeah.
versed in, but fascinating just kind of seeing all these different species.
Yeah, for sure. I think this is a very underappreciated group. That's definitely true. And I think partly because like the Sylviidans in general tend to be like pretty drab. Like most of them are not that brightly colored. A few of these ones are, like a few of the Sylvioids are, but for the most part, they're not really well known for their appearance. And yeah, they definitely don't have much of a presence in like popular consciousness. But definitely, I think they have a lot of interesting evolutionary stories to tell.
Hmm.
Alrighty, so let's jump to the next group on the next slide, the second major group of Passeridians. So these are the Muscicapidans. So they include like some of the lineages that are shown here. So they include a group called the kinglets. These are a group of very small songbirds, and they are also very remarkable for being able to endure like very harsh winters that some of the species do. Like even though they're tiny, tiny birds. In fact, the smallest bird in Britain is the goldcrest, which is a member of this group. And yeah, it's just this tiny fluff ball. Like there's a little tiny pom pom ball shaped thing, and they can survive through like snowy winters. Um, it's absolutely remarkable. There's a book. I think it's by Bern Heinrich. It's called A Winter World, and in that book, he goes into a lot of detail about his research trying to figure out how kinglets manage to survive winters. So that's definitely a book that is worth reading if you're interested in that subject. Then we have a group called the Bombacilloids. This includes probably most familiar to us, temperate zone folks in the northern hemisphere, are the waxwings. The waxwings are a group that wanders around in a big flocks. They're really handsome birds. They have this really soft, silky plumage. You can kind of make it out in the image here, where look how smooth they look. Like yeah. They have this really soft plumage, and they wander around in huge flocks, eating fruits mostly. I know some of my friends joke about how you can't have a photo of a waxwing without it eating like photogenic red berries or things like that.
Yeah.
because yeah, that's primarily what they eat and most of what you'll see them doing. Um, and yeah, they are definitely really handsome birds. I always appreciate seeing them around. Now the waxwings are the most familiar member of the Bombacilloids, but they do have various cousins from like rather far flung areas. Like for example, there's a species called the Hypocoleus from the Middle East, and like there's a species called the Halocitria from the Indonesian islands, so very far away from where any waxwings can be found. But yeah, they're a lot more poorly studied. But a lot of the members of Bombacilloidea are similar in behavior to the waxwings. They are soft and silky in their plumage, and they live in flocks and they wander around eating berries and things. So pretty interesting group of birds. Then we have a little radiation called the Certhioids, and they include several groups that are also familiar to us, those of us in Europe and northern North America. So they include the nuthatches, and so this picture is not turned upside down. The bird actually is upside down in this picture. So yeah, nuthatches are amazing little birds. They're some of my favorite songbirds, I have to say. Though they have a very distinctive behavior. They'll creep up and down tree trunks and on the underside of branches, and oftentimes they'll walk upside down like this, or like turn to face downward, and then climb down tree trunks head first. And by doing this, they can search for little insects and things in the crevices of tree bark and such. Really remarkable birds with a lot of personality. I love nuthatches. They're great.
Oh yeah, I see them
Yeah,
quite a bit around here.
yeah,
Actually,
I
they're
imagine.
one of the songbirds that I see the most.
Right. Yeah, they are lovely, and yeah, definitely a pretty common sight in the right habitat. I definitely saw them pretty often back in the States, and I see them occasionally over here as well. So yeah, it's really cool. Um, and I also do like the tree creepers a lot. The tree creepers, they tend to be a bit more low key than the nuthatches. That's because they're more cryptically colored. You can see that they're kind of mostly brown, so they're harder to see against the tree trunks. And they prefer to creep upwards on the tree trunks, and that's why they're called tree creepers. Um, they tend to kind of stay out of the way and don't really draw much attention to themselves, so they can be a bit harder to see, but they're not uncommon. So if you're in appropriate habitat, you can often and if you're lucky, you might be able to catch a glimpse of one. Um, and then, interesting enough, these two groups of like kind of tree climbing songbirds are closely related to the wrens. These are the true wrens, finally, after seeing a bunch of imposter wrens from a few slides ago. These are the true wrens. The true wrens are primarily found in the Americas. That's the center of their diversity. But there is like one species that's found widely across Eurasia. So it is still nonetheless a pretty familiar bird in these parts. And the wrens, even though they are not very brightly colored birds, they are very loud birds, and like they are disproportionately loud for how tiny they are. Most of them are pretty small birds, but like you wouldn't know it from how loud they can sing. And so it's often pretty easy to be able to identify and find wrens from their songs, because yeah, they'll let you know they're there. And then finally, we have the Muscicapoids within this group, which, again, we're going to have to turn to another slide to tell their story. But before we get there, on the next slide, I do want to highlight an extinct group of Muscicapidans. And so these are called the OO. Um, so this is a very interesting group. There were 5 species that were recently around, but all of them have gone extinct. And they were specialized nectar feeders. You can see that they have these long, slightly decurved bills for reaching nectar. And traditionally, it was thought that they were a type of honey eater. Like we saw honey eaters like many slides back, like when we were introducing songbirds. So you can tell that they're very distantly related. The honey eaters are from the Muscicapidans. But genetic studies then did their thing, and it turns out that very unexpectedly, the OO were not weird honey eaters, but were instead members of Bombacilloidea, the group that includes the waxwings and their kin, which is completely unexpected. So yeah. Now the OO are found only on the Hawaiian Islands, or they were found there until they went extinct. And so they used to be called the Hawaiian honey eaters, but since they are now considered bombacilloids, we don't use that as often anymore. Um, OO is one of their kind of indigenous names based on their call. So apparently they're pretty well known for their calls. Um, and as for why they went extinct, well, probably habitat destruction played a big role as humans came in and just started, spreading agriculture and such. They had to clear away a lot of the suitable habitat for these birds. But also, invasive species are also a big problem on the Hawaiian Islands as well. And particularly a problem for the birds is invasive mosquitoes, because it turns out that a lot of these mosquitoes transmit avian malaria, and the Hawaiian birds have been isolated for so long that they don't have any kind of like immunity against avian malaria, and so a lot of them have been driven to extinction because of the introduction of these mosquitoes, and many of them are like, kind of just clinging on by like heading to like high altitudes where it's too cold for the mosquitoes. But as global warming continues, you can kind of see where that's going, right? So
Hmm.
yeah, there are definitely efforts underway to try and control the spread of avian malaria on on the Hawaiian Islands. But yeah, it's definitely going to be a challenge. But unfortunately, it is too late for the OO. I'd like to stress that they are a recent extinction, like as a group at least. The last species to go extinct was last recorded in 1987, and I actually pictured a photo of one here. Like this is a color photo of the last species of OO, and that was the Kauai OO. And it's a really kind of sad and depressing story because like people recorded the species going extinct in real time, basically. Like by the 1980s, there was only a single pair known to exist, um, and people continued to observe them for some time. But one day, a hurricane came through, and then the female of that pair disappeared after that. Um, and then after the female disappeared, the male started to sing courtship songs, and people continued to record those songs. Um, but there never was any answer to his courtship song, and eventually, after 1987, people did not hear his song anymore, and that was the end of that.
Yeah, I remember
Um,
seeing that in the Discovery Channel documentary Racing Extinction.
mhm.
They actually played the recordings of that.
Yeah,
Um,
right, right.
that is very yeah, it's like a hauntingly sad story for
Right.
sure.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And I think it really highlights like the precariousness when you have really tiny populations like that. Like, a hurricane is a natural event, right? Like normally hurricanes go through the Hawaiian Islands all the time, um, and probably they kill some birds as they do. But the thing is, if you have a large enough population, those populations can recover from losses like that.
Hmm.
Um, but when a population has been driven to the point where there's only a single pair left, like any kind of accident, like whether it is anthropogenic or not, that could spell the end for that species. So, yeah, I think that's definitely a lesson conservationists have taken to heart. Rarity is the pathway to extinction. So, yeah, certainly a very interesting and distinctive group of birds, and it's really sad that we're not, going to be able to observe them in life anymore because, like, yeah, these weird island dwelling nectar feeding bombacilloids, what was their biology like? Like we don't really know that much about them, but yeah,
Hmm.
now all we have left are we have to piece together from their remains and from um, observations of people who wrote them down. So yeah, definitely one of the biggest losses within the songbirds in terms of like recently extinct forms. But we can continue on to the next slide and look at the Muscicapoids, the final group of Muscicapidans that we haven't looked at. And this group includes some pretty weird groups. For example, the dippers. The dippers are the only group of semi-aquatic songbirds. Yeah, you heard that right. They are semi-aquatic. They live near streams and rivers and such, and they will dive into the water and kind of fly underwater with their wings. So they use their wings to propel themselves underwater, that is. And then they search for like mostly aquatic insects under the water, sometimes little fish and things like that. And that's how they live. They're definitely a really cool group, and they are found in Eurasia and the Americas. Then we have the oxpeckers, which also have a very weird lifestyle. The oxpeckers, yeah, they spend most of their lives on the bodies of large herbivorous mammals. So yeah, imagine that. Pretty much the only times they leave their hosts, as we say, they leave their mammalian hosts, are to nest, and in one species, I think, to sleep. But the yellow-billed oxpecker pictured here, it actually has been recorded that even at night they will actually stay roosting on top of the bodies of their hosts. Yeah, so there are these photos that were going around of oxpeckers like sleeping on giraffes, and so yeah, quite a remarkable sight. And what they're doing on the backs of these mammals is that they get their food there. So they will feed on like skin parasites like ticks, of course. And kind of the classic idea is that this was a primarily or a completely mutualistic relationship. Like the oxpeckers would be cleaning these large mammals of their parasites. And that's good for the mammal and good for the birds. So everybody's happy. But some recent research has suggested that actually, the oxpeckers are not a completely positive force from the perspective of the mammals, because it turns out that oxpeckers also really like to drink blood, which is actually one of the reasons they go after ticks, because after the ticks have drunk the blood, the oxpeckers can just pick them up and, get the extra protein from the tick as well. But sometimes if there aren't really enough skin parasites to go around, the oxpeckers will feed from open wounds of their hosts, and that can be pretty irritating, as you might imagine. Yes, keeping the wounds from healing, and sometimes they'll go to the trouble of keeping those wounds open. They'll keep pecking at it and letting the blood continue to flow because they like blood. And they'll eat other things on the host as well, like dead skin flakes and earwax and such. And it is less clear, like what, if any, kind of effect that has on the mammalian host. But yeah, so oxpeckers are not always a completely positive force for the host. And in fact, there are specific species of like large mammalian herbivores from Africa, because oxpeckers are currently only known from Africa. That do not tolerate oxpeckers at all. Like if oxpeckers try to land on them, they'll like shake them off, or like swat at them, or rub against trees and such. So it is only like some species of mammalian herbivores that will tolerate having oxpeckers on them, and I don't think it is entirely clear why that is. So probably it has to do with like that balance of like benefit versus harm that they do. Like maybe they are more beneficial to some species than to others. One thing that they does add to their kind of beneficial side from the mammalian perspective is that they will often give alarm calls when there is danger about. So if they spot a predator or something, they'll give alarm calls, which of course is a pretty useful thing for most plant-eating mammals, having that extra warning. And in fact, it has been experimentally shown that, for example, oxpeckers are a very effective warning system for rhinos when they're being approached by humans. So oxpeckers have had this reputation for a long time among hunters, for example. If there are oxpeckers on a rhino, they'll tell the rhino when you're coming. And recently, like in recent years, people actually have done experiments where they try to approach rhinos, and yeah, it turns out rhinos with oxpeckers really do detect humans coming more quickly. The oxpeckers do serve a pretty good benefit to mammals in that sense. But super weird group that spends its lives on the bodies of other animals, and almost like in a parasitic fashion, but with some benefits too. So not completely. Yeah, pretty odd. Then Then we have the mimids, mostly, this is an American group that includes the mockingbirds and thrashers and catbirds, and they are called the mimids primarily because they are very well known for their vocal mimicry abilities, and like kind of like the lyrebirds we talked about earlier, they often incorporate the sounds that they hear into their songs, so they can sing very complex songs that are composed of all like the different types of sounds that they pick up from their environment, which is very interesting. In fact, many of the members of the Muscicapoids are very skilled mimics and have like these very complex kinds of songs. The starlings, for example, are another group that are very good at mimicking sounds. And I think there have been people who have been able to like teach starlings to repeat words, for example, and teach them to quote unquote speak, basically, which is pretty fun, of course, as a gimmick. And the starlings, they are primarily found in Afro-Eurasia, but I think they're pretty well known among North Americans now because they have been introduced to North America and are quite successful, unfortunately. They're to the detriment of some of the native bird species. The European starling often competes with all the native North American birds for nesting sites. They nest in like tree cavities, and that's where a lot of other North American birds like to nest as well. And so, no thanks to that, many North American birds have undergone steep declines because of it. But in their native habitat, I think starlings are a delight, and many of them are really brightly colored. In fact, they're really shiny. You could say they have these nice iridescent feathers, as you can see in the image here. This is a superb starling, which is very well named. There's a lot of research like done on like the evolution of iridescence in starlings because like many different species of starlings have like many different ways of generating like this iridescence and the different types of iridescence and such. And yeah, it's all a pretty fascinating story about the evolution of signaling. And incidentally, I might as well mention that starlings don't exhibit a lot of sexual dimorphism. So, like, it's both the males and the females that are shiny like this. So, again, we're seeing probably mutual sexual selection here, where the shiny plumage is critical for both sexes to kind of evaluate potential mates. Um, then we have the thrushes, which are probably another familiar group to people in most parts of the world, I think. So I have pictured the American robin, which certainly is a familiar bird across most of North America. And over here in Europe, the common blackbird is another example of a very commonly seen and familiar bird. And yeah, the thrushes, they're an interesting group in that they kind of have divided their time between the trees and the ground. So they are kind of specialized for feeding on the ground mostly, but they nest in trees, and they'll also feed a bit in trees as well on things like fruits and such. And so they are very good at adapting to like semi-open habitats where there are like some trees but also like some open spaces in between. And probably it's because of that some species of thrushes, like the American robin and the common blackbird of Europe, have become very well adapted to suburban habitats, and that's why you see them in like your gardens and such, because of this kind of the way that they have become adapted to like a partially tree dwelling, partially ground dwelling lifestyle. And closely related to the thrushes are the Afro-Eurasian flycatchers, and so they include a number of species that do this sort of fly-catching behavior that I described before, and that's why they're called the flycatchers. But it turns out that they also include a large number of species, like the European robin, and so you can see here that the European robin and the American robin are not like each other's closest relatives. So the European robin is a member of these Afro-Eurasian flycatchers, whereas the American robin is a thrush. But in the grand scheme of things, they are still pretty close, I suppose, since they're both Muscicapoids. And in any case, yeah, there are a number of like these Afro-Eurasian flycatchers that are built more like the European robin, and they're not so much kind of looking for flies in high perches, but more staying close to the ground and pouncing on insects near close to the ground and things like that. So a lot of those species have been called chats. So yeah, in any case, they are as we've gotten more genetic evidence, we've come to recognize them as members of the Afro-Eurasian flycatchers. So yeah, definitely a group with a lot of very interesting lifestyles. Do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly getting to familiar territory
Hmm.
here.
Right.
The northern mockingbird is another one that I just see all the time.
Oh yeah.
Um, One of my favorite things to see them do when they're on the lawn, well, back at the old house, is like this little wing flap that they do, where like they'll kind of stand out in the open and just kind of open their wings and close them again.
That's right.
I've looked this up before. As I understand it, I don't think there's like a concrete explanation yet as to why this is, but I have heard it argued that like a it's like a way to like freak out insects or
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah, I think that's the leading hypothesis, at least. Yes. So it's kind of a bit like the fantails I described earlier, where they kind of flash the bright patches on their tail. But in this case, the mockingbirds use their wings. And yeah, it seems that these kind of bright flashes of white seem to scare the insects, and they out of their hiding spaces, and then the birds can go after them. So yeah, that's I think the leading explanation for that.
Right, right. And then like just the Eurasian starling.
Hmm.
Yeah, when haven't I seen those guys around?
Right.
They're very good at like getting into places,
Hmm.
like human constructed human constructions. The when I'd be in middle school or high school, like they'd somehow get into the gym and like make nests in the rafters
Yeah,
and
right.
get in the front of the school underneath like roof tiles and stuff. And yeah, it's a real shame that well, one that they're an introduced species and that they're
Hmm.
so destructive to other birds. Because like to me, like they're really gorgeous birds.
Hmm.
Like they're a delight to look at. It's just a real shame that they're so
Yeah,
destructive.
definitely.
It's like an alluring evil almost. I mean,
Right, right.
they're not, they're not evil animals.
Of
It's
course,
just
of course.
those are human constructs. But still,
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, I am glad to be able to see them here in their kind of native range.
oh for sure. And I'm very curious about that as well.
Hmm.
Like how they do in their native range.
Yeah,
It's like like it's like reading about the cane toads in South
right,
America.
yeah.
How they're preyed upon normally, and
Right,
they're
right.
not like overrunning the place like they are in Australia.
Right, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I would say, like, the starlings here are definitely not as common as they are in the States, at least in places where I've lived. So yeah, it does seem that the the ecosystem checks and balances actually work on them here. Um, I think there have been some concerns in recent years of like some declines in their native range, and
Oh,
the
really?
reasons for that is not entirely clear. But yeah, like maybe we should like round up the ones in America and send them over.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I mean, we certainly got plenty of them.
Right, right.
Now, isn't it? Now, I don't know if this is still true or not, because this is something I would read all the time in bird books. That the reason we have starlings in North America in the first place is because somebody who really loves Shakespeare decided that it would be a great idea to take all the birds mentioned in his plays and just let them loose in the early American colonies and cities, so that way
Right.
people can get inspired, I guess, or whatever. I don't know if that's still the case or not, but that's usually what I've read.
Yeah, that's the story I've heard. Yeah, I haven't double checked if that is still considered legit or not, but yeah, I have also definitely heard that very widely.
It's just kind of a
Right.
weird reason to release an animal.
Yeah, for sure, especially one that ended up with such massive kind of ecological ramifications. But yeah, people are weird sometimes.
Oh yeah, it's the same with like the friggin' the Finding Nemo stuff.
Oh
That movie
yeah,
comes out and people love the regal tang and the
right,
clownfish, and so
right,
they either start taking them en masse
right.
from the reefs to have as pets, or they think, oh, all drains lead to the ocean, so
Oh
I should
right,
free my fish down the toilet and they'll
God,
be saved. And then they forget, like, oh, I mean, it's not like a straight shot to the ocean. There's like
right.
gears and stuff that crush matter, so
Yeah, right, right.
you're not really helping.
Yeah. Ah, yes. Yep. Definitely remember the stories about that. Rather unfortunate. Um, but we can continue on. We're close to the end of like passeriform diversity here. So the kind of final major group are the Passerida. And yeah, these are definitely a really diverse group. So they include groups like the flower peckers and the sunbirds from mostly from tropical Asia, also Africa in the case of sunbirds.
Hmm.
And the sunbirds in particular are nectar feeders. You can see that they also have that long, slightly decurved bill that is so common to like birds of that niche. The flower peckers, despite their name, are more fruit eaters. Some of them are specialized in feeding on mistletoe berries, actually. So yeah, mistletoe actually depends a lot on the flower peckers for dispersing seeds. In fact, there's one particular species called the mistletoe bird. So yeah,
Hmm.
that tells you how closely associated they are. Um, and then something really interesting about the Passeridans is that this is the group where you get a lot of members that are like specialist seed eaters. So you start getting that really robust, thick, finch-like triangular beak. So yeah, not only in the true finches, but in several other groups as well, as we shall see coming up shortly, like the weavers and indigo birds and the waxbills are all like members, representatives that have these like conical seed-cracking beaks. And all of these groups are pretty interesting in their life history. Like the weaver birds, for example, are so named because they weave these really complex nests, often like hanging from branches of trees, as you can see in the image here. Yeah, a lot of times the males that build these nests, and they kind of use them as a way to attract females. And these nests do actually get used as nests. So yeah, they better make sure that they are very good at making a nest that actually works and will keep out predators and keep the eggs safe and such. Um, so yeah, and there are some species of weavers that are very social, and they build like these massive, like gigantic nests in the trees that are where a lot of different birds like just live in all together, and they have like individual chambers inside where the different families live. But yeah, it's amazing to look at. And many other types of birds that aren't weavers will actually often take advantage of those gigantic nests, and they'll move into like abandoned chambers within the nests and make their own nests there, because it's a pretty safe place to live. And closely related to the weavers are a group called the indigo birds. Indigo birds are interesting because they are brood parasites. That means they lay their eggs in the nests of other types of birds. And in fact, their main targets are their close relatives, the weaver birds and the waxbills, which I'll talk about soon. So yeah, they are a group of these finch-like birds that parasitize the birds that they're closely related to. And it is quite interesting because being reared by other species as songbirds, they end up learning the songs of uh, whichever species they were reared by. Um, yeah, and so apparently this seems to be how females identify which birds to lay their eggs in the nests of. Now somehow they don't actually end up they don't actually confuse uh, their host species for mates. So they are still the females are still attracted to the males of their own species. You know, the males sing the songs or incorporate songs from whatever species they were reared by into their courtship displays. But yeah, and then the females use these songs also to recognize which species to parasitize basically and lay their eggs inside those nests. And yeah, it's really interesting. And as far as we know, I think the indigo birds don't usually kill their foster siblings, so they kind of just live alongside them and are reared alongside them, which is pretty good for the hosts. And there's a pretty interesting kind of mimicry going on here, but I'll explain a bit when I get into waxbills, which I'll do now. As waxbills are a very diverse group of these. Also, finch-like birds, they include some very colorful forms like the Goldian finch from Australia that I pictured on here. They also include another one that people might have heard of, the zebra finch, which is also from Australia. The
Oh,
zebra
yeah.
finch is kind of a model organism in a lot of research on songbirds, like researching how songbirds learn their songs, for example. Like a lot of that research has been done on zebra finches because they're pretty easy to rear in a laboratory setting. But something really weird about the waxbills is that they're young. A lot of them have like these weird flanges and patches of bold patterns on the sides of their mouths. Yeah, like go look up pictures of like baby waxbills, if you haven't seen this, but it's really weird. So like they have these boldly contrasting patterns on the sides of their mouths, and they often stick out as these little wattle-like structures. And in fact, they almost look like the lights on the side of a runway for a plane, for example. And it seems that this actually is basically their function, because waxbills often nest in these like enclosed nests. Like they don't nest in open nests where the light will shine in, or where there's a lot of light shining in. So it seems that the juveniles have evolved like these bold color patches to tell the parents like, this is where my mouth is, so put the food here, put the food here. So, which is really really cool. And so the thing about the indigo birds is that to kind of mimic this, their young have also evolved the same kinds of patterns on the sides of their bill, and these match very closely to the specific species of waxbills that they parasitize. So yeah, that is a really cool bit of coevolution going on, and it's all happening in like this basic small clade of like passeridan birds. So yeah, very cool. And then we have a group called the assenters. The assenters do not have like these big finch-like beaks, so they're more insect eaters. Although they eat like small seeds, but yeah, they're not able to like crack huge seeds like the more finch-like birds are able to. The assenters are a group that is more familiar in Eurasia. Over here in Britain, the dunnock, which is sometimes called the hedge sparrow, is a familiar backyard bird. It's one of the lowland species. Most assenters actually prefer to live in the kind of alpine habitats. And assenters, even though they don't look super exciting, they are heavily studied, at least some species are, like the dunnock, because they have very complex sex lives, basically. Like any kind of mating system you can imagine, like the same species of a center, even in the same region, might practice all of them. Like they might have one male and one female together. They might have one male with many females. They might have one female with many males. They might have many females and many males, like all mating with each other. So yeah, like they have very complex social behaviors that seems to be driven by like kind of conflicting priorities between the sexes, as it were. Like essentially the for the males, it's more effective to pass on more of their genes by mating with many more females, but for the females, it is more efficient to have males helping them, take care of their young and such. And so like they'll also like mate with like several males sometimes. Sometimes that's the most effective strategy to do that. And so yeah, it's there's sort of a kind of balancing act going on there, and that creates these really complex kind of situations. So the assenters are very well studied for that.
It's funny. I was reading about dunnocks
Yeah.
in the Book of Humans.
Oh, cool.
They had a section in talking about sexual reproduction and well the ways of having sex that don't involve the genitals.
I
Um,
see. Right. Right.
and so like they mentioned, I guess there's a one part where dunnocks have been observed. Like the males will pick at the cloaca of the
Yeah.
female to like take out sperm
That's right.
from other males that have
Right.
mated,
Yes.
which seems very convoluted, but it works, I guess.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's right. That's right. They'll do that. Now, next we have the Afro-Eurasian sparrows. So they include the very familiar house sparrow, and that's another species that has been introduced to North America and some other parts of the world too, even though it's natively found in like Eurasia. So yeah, primarily the Afro-Eurasian sparrows are a Afro-Eurasian group, as the name suggests, and yeah, they are another group of seed-eating birds, and in fact, they have a distinctive bone in their tongue that it seems that no other birds have, and probably that relates to them using their tongue as part of their food processing. So they use the tongue to like kind of anchor the seed in place while they crack it, for example. So yeah, that's kind of an interesting anatomical trait. And then we have the wagtails and the pipits, which are found pretty much all over the world except for Antarctica, mostly found in open habitats. And they're a group that also lacks kind of a finch-like bill, so they're more insect eaters. And many of them have a very distinctive behavior where they kind of wag the tail up and down, and that's why they're called wagtails. Although, incidentally, there is an Australian bird called the willy wagtail, which is not a member of this group. Yeah, the willy wagtail is a member of the fantail, is a member of the corvidian birds that I covered earlier. But yeah, that's kind of beside the point. Yeah, otherwise the wagtails and pipits, they're a pretty easily recognizable group. I do see like the white wagtail around here, for example. They're not as common in North America. I know, like the pipits can be found in some places, but like you need to be in suitable habitat to see them. So I know they are less familiar over there. But yeah, in many parts of the world, wagtails and pipits are a pretty common sight. Um, and then we have the true finches, which are a very diverse group, mostly of seed cracking birds. But as we shall see, they have evolved into other forms as well. And then finally, we have a group called the emberizoids, which are primarily found in the Americas. In fact, many of the most familiar American songbirds are members of the emberizoids. But before we get there, as I think pretty much everyone who is into evolutionary biology knows, there is one particular group of finches that is a textbook example of adaptive radiation and has evolved into a myriad of forms on a particular series of Pacific islands. And so on the next slide, we are going to meet them. And so that group of finches is the Hawaiian honey creepers. Yeah. Did I get you there?
It sounded like you were being very vague, and I'm like, wait a sec.
Yeah, okay, so if you were thinking of Darwin's finches are not true finches. They are, in fact, members of the emberizoid clade that we'll get to later. But there is, in fact, a major adaptive radiation of finches on some of the Pacific islands, and those are the Hawaiian honey creepers. And I highlight them here not only because they are such a triumphant example of adaptive radiation. You can see a sampling of some of the species out there in the cover art of this journal article here. So you got species that look like regular finches, but you also got little species with thin little beaks that look more like warblers. You got nectar feeding species. That's why they're called honey creepers. You got some with like almost parrot like hooked bills. So that particular species apparently feeds by like cracking open like dead branches and things and exposing the insects inside.
Wow.
Yeah, and there's one on the top left here, the yellowish one with a slender hooked bill. That one feeds by pecking holes in the tree bark, but it does that in a kind of weird way that you might not expect. So it uses its lower jaw, which is more chisel shaped, to kind of make these holes in the tree bark, and then it uses its upper jaw, which is more slender and curved, to reach inside and grab the insects. So yeah, kind of an interesting way of doing the woodpecker thing without looking like a woodpecker. So yeah, absolutely remarkable radiation. But I highlight them here not only because of that, but also because there are many recently extinct Hawaiian honey creepers. So there are 18 living species, and to be honest, that's kind of optimistic because there are a couple that haven't really been seen in a while and might actually be extinct. But there are over 30 that have been named so far, 30 recently extinct species. So yeah, they used to be even more diverse than what is shown here. Many of these went extinct like before being recorded by Western scientists. So they probably died out from like earlier causes. But certainly the ones that are still around today, they are threatened by like invasive species like the mosquitoes that spread avian malaria, like we mentioned earlier. They are threatened by habitat destruction. They're also threatened by predation from feral cats and other predators that have been introduced to the islands. So yeah, there are definitely a lot of conservation projects out there to try and preserve the species that we still have. But it is rather sad and also remarkable that there used to be so many more. And some of them appear to have been doing things that were completely different from the rest. Basically, like for example, I've shown here the bills from two species that have been called the shovel-billed finch. Um, the shovel-billed finches, I suppose, since there are two. And they are only known from like fossil remains, but they have these like kind of weirdly shaped bills. Like they're kind of flat and a little broad, kind of blunt at the end, and it's hard to say what these bills would have been good for because uh, they aren't sharp enough to like peck and do anything. They aren't robust enough to crack seeds. They aren't slender enough to take nectar. Uh, like what's up with that? Like we don't really know. We don't have any like living analog for this, or at least not a very close analog. So the best we've been able to come up with is maybe they're catching insects in flight. So like kind of a sort of widened, flattened bill might be good for that. But still, there might be something we haven't figured out yet. And in fact, at least one of these species has a lot of little sensory pits on the tip of its bill. So it was using its bill to like sense something, but yeah, we don't know like exactly how it was used at all. So very weird. And there are some other like extinct Hawaiian honey creepers with like also similarly baffling kind of anatomies too. So yeah, definitely a really cool group, and it is a shame that we don't have as many of them left anymore. Do you have anything to add to that?
Just that I think it's interesting that as diverse as this group is today, with the ones that are still around, I think it's amazing that they are even more diverse
Yeah,
until fairly recently.
totally. Yeah, absolutely.
It's
Uh,
like they took full advantage of like whatever niches was available. I'm
right.
surprised we didn't get like an eagle like one.
Yeah, right. Indeed. Uh, yeah,
Or
super
like
cool.
a coastal one that like dives in the water
Oh
or something.
right, yeah, that would have been cool for sure. Oh, I guess since we're on that subject, there is a very cool speculative biology subject called the Serena project. The premise is that these canaries are a kind of finch, by the way. Canaries were introduced to this planet alongside some other Earth organisms. So like they have like guppies in the water and like some arthropods and some plants. But yeah, basically the canaries are the main kind of land vertebrate, or the only land vertebrates that were introduced to this planet. And then the hypothetical is like, oh, so how would these canaries evolve in millions of years, over millions of years? And yeah, it gets really wild as the kind of timeline goes on. But you do get kind of the initial radiation of canaries, which is very similar to the Hawaiian honey creepers, presumably inspired by phenomena like this. So yeah, that's a pretty fun project, and of course it makes use of another group of finches. So that's pretty neat.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that
Oh
one.
really? Okay. Well, I'll have to leave a link in the description then. Yeah.
Yeah, check that out.
Yeah. It gets really wild, believe me. Like by the time like you get to several like 100 million years in, like a lot of these things don't look like birds anymore, and it's like, whoa.
I think that's to be expected
Yeah,
for
exactly.
most organisms. I
Right.
mean, it's like doing a project where you let a bunch of mammals that like a little like shrew looking
Mm,
things right out on a planet, and then
yeah.
you get things like whales and elephants. It's like
Exactly. Yep, and that's one that actually happened. Alrighty, so let's continue onward. And finally, we are at the final slide of regarding like our overview of passerine diversity. Um, and so, this is the Emberizoids. So their stronghold is in the Americas. And so many of the familiar songbirds that we see in the Americas are members of this group, but they're not exclusive to the Americas. So, for example, there's a group called the Afro-Eurasian buntings, the mostly a ground-dwelling seed-eating group found in usually semi-open habitats. So they can be found in Afro-Eurasia, but pretty much all the rest of the groups that are shown here are American groups and have done very well for themselves there. So we have, for example, the American sparrows. So these are, in some ways similar to the Afro-Eurasian sparrows. Like they're all kind of drably colored seed-eating birds. Although some of them do have like pretty bold patterns, like this white-crowned sparrow. Look at that nice little cap on the head. They look pretty cool. But yeah, they do look vaguely like Afro-Eurasian sparrows, so they ended up being called the American sparrows. But of course, they are not each other's closest relatives. We have the American blackbirds, which are a very diverse group. They include things like the red-winged blackbird that are shown here, but they also include the cowbirds, which are a group of brood parasites, so another group of birds that lays their eggs inside the nests of other birds and don't take care of their own young. They include things like the American orioles that I mentioned earlier, so they are members of the American blackbird group. They include the grackles, which are these really shiny American blackbirds. Many people in North America are probably familiar with those. They're pretty common. Yeah. They include a neotropical group called the oropendulas, and these build like these hanging nests. Like they weave these long like nests that are suspended from like tree branches, and oftentimes they'll nest close to wasp nests, and in doing so that seems to protect them from predators because of course not that many things want to mess with wasps. So yeah, the oropendulas will nest close to wasps to kind of gain that extra protection. And then we have the American warblers, and as you can see, they are not closely related at all to any of the Afro-Eurasian groups that we called warblers earlier. The American warblers, they kind of occupy a similar niche, like small insect-eating birds, but yeah, very distant relatives. And many of them are very colorful, so that's quite unlike the Afro-Eurasian groups of warblers. So many of the American warblers are very brightly colored, especially in breeding season and especially in the males. There was a very interesting study that came out a while ago about the evolution of this kind of breeding plumage, because what happens is that the males will molt into this very bright color on their breeding grounds, and it seems that this phenomenon is driven by migration. So what happens is that some of the species of American warblers travel between basically the neotropics and northern North America. They breed in the north, and so it seems that because they migrate for these long distances, in fact, American warblers are responsible for some of the longest migrations among American songbirds. They had to evolve a second molt, so they had to replace their feathers a second time to withstand all the wear they go through when they undergo these long migrations. And so because they undergo the second molt, that gives them the opportunity to evolve these brightly colored breeding plumages, because then they have that second molt and then they can have these bright colors grow in, and then later on they can molt again and then molt back into their non-breeding plumage. So yeah, that seems to be a really cool kind of evolutionary phenomenon there, and that was pretty recently discovered. Then we have the cardinals, which are a seed-eating group in which the males and females often look quite different, a very strong sexual dimorphism, as you probably know if you're familiar with cardinals. The northern cardinal in particular, as pictured here, males are very bright red, whereas the females have more of a red wash and are more kind of brownish in color. And the cardinals not only include like species that we call cardinals, like the northern cardinals, but also include the American buntings, so things like the very beautiful painted bunting, or things like the indigo bunting, which is the males are bright blue. One of my favorite cardinals is the Lasley bunting, which is another blue species. They look amazing. Despite their strong sexual dimorphism, the males actually will help with the rearing of the young, which is pretty interesting. As we mentioned before, a lot of times strong sexual dimorphism means that the male birds don't really play much of a part in parental care, but that's not the case in the cardinals. Also, the cardinals include some species that we call tanagers that migrate into North America, like the scarlet tanager is actually a member of the cardinal group. But the cardinals are closely related to the true tanagers, so it's really not that much of a stretch, I guess, the name-wise. And the true tanagers are a super diverse group. Like they don't really get north of Mexico, but like below that, like they are everywhere, and there are so many different species. Many of them are very brightly colored. They occupy many different niches. There are like nectar specialists. There are species that specialize in stealing nectar, and what they do is like they are specialized for poking a hole at the base of a flower and then drinking the nectar from the base instead of going through the side that has the pollen and where the plant wants pollinators to go. So yeah, those are called the flower piercers, and they specialize in stealing nectar that way. There are species that feed on seeds. So the Darwin's finches are actually members of the tanagers. They are not finches. They are actually an offshoot of the tanagers. The tanagers can be found in like pretty much every habitat down there imaginable. There's one that nests up in the glaciers, which is wild. Yeah, they build nests like directly on top like the ice and then just nest there. Um, yeah, they are absolutely remarkable group, and unfortunately we do not have time whatsoever to get into all that diversity. Um, but yeah, I guess I'll finally mention kind of the role of Darwin's finches, since they are quite emblematic of like evolutionary biology. So I might as well mention this. Contrary to probably popular belief, Darwin didn't exactly have a eureka moment on the Galapagos Islands while he was traveling there. And he certainly didn't really notice that, or what would later become to be called the Darwin's finches, that he was collecting were like all these closely related forms that had become specialized for different niches. It was only later when he sent them back to England when an ornithologist took a look at them and said, "Oh wow, these are actually all like closely related species of birds, even though they look so different." So it was only then that Darwin started to incorporate them into his theories of natural selection. If anything, he did take note of the Galapagos mockingbirds while he was traveling there. He did notice that, oh, look, this mockingbird is slightly different from that species of mockingbird that was on a different island. That's kind of odd. So if anything, the Galapagos mockingbirds probably had more of a part in actually inspiring him to think about these questions relating to evolution. But it is true that the Darwin's finches are an excellent example of adaptive radiation, and he did end up mentioning them in passing in his books. And since Darwin's time, there have actually been a lot of studies that closely monitoring like Darwin's finches that have revealed a lot about their evolution, like in real time, like how their sizes of their beaks change in response to specific events, like droughts, for example, or like the presence of other species on the islands. Like how does that cause a niche partitioning to form, and also hybrid speciation. Like people have observed like one species of Darwin's finch ending up on another island and mating with one of the locals of a different species and producing like a new lineage that is different from both of the parent species. So all of those are like major like evolutionary studies that have been done and are still being done on the Darwin's finches. Primarily thanks in large part to the pioneering work of a couple of biologists, Peter and Rosemary Grant. And if you look them up, you can read a lot about their research in this area. So yeah, Darwin's finches, even though they're not quite the birds that inspire Darwin necessarily, at least not in the sense that pop culture tends to depict it. But I do think they are quite deserving as kind of emblems of like natural selection because they have been so well studied in that aspect of their biology. All right, so that's our review of passeriform diversity. And before I continue, I'll just mention that two of the photos used on the slide were taken by our friend Chris, the red-winged blackbird picture here and the northern cardinal, and so I decided to use them for this slide. So yeah, thanks for that. And do you have anything to add before we move on?
Yeah, wow, passerine diversity. Gosh, where would I even start? I think it's just remarkable how, even if, I guess on a superficial level, a lot of the anatomy of these birds do kind of converge on similarities,
Right.
that you still get this explosively large diversity in behaviors
Yes.
and colorations and I mean distribution certainly. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I think it kind of goes to show like when you got a body plan that's really versatile and
Right.
adaptable, like if the conditions are right, nature will just let it
Yeah.
take off in as many directions as it can.
Mm-hmm.
And I think certainly the passeriforms are like one of the poster childs of this phenomena,
Yeah.
alongside like I don't know, maybe the beetles.
Right. Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, All right, so the next slide is just more of a review of what we just talked about. So we have the stem passeriforms, the Psittacopedids, and the zygodactylids that are, outside of the crown passeriform diversity, but are their kind of zygodactyl extinct relatives. Um, then we have the New Zealand wrens out on the branch by themselves, and then the remaining passeriforms split into the subalcines, clade tyranni, and then the passeri, which are the songbirds. Within the subalcines, you have the Afro-Eurasian clade and the American clade, whereas within the songbirds, you have the crow-related clade and the sparrow-related clade, and actually a few others that I kind of had to leave out here. Um, and then within the sparrow-related clade, you have like the Sylviidans, the kind of Afro-Eurasian warbler group, the Muscicapidans, which include things like the Afro-Eurasian flycatchers, the thrushes, the nuthatches, the wrens, the waxwings, and the kinglets, and the Passeridans, which include a lot of the finch-like birds, and also a big radiation of American songbirds, like the American warblers and the American blackbirds and such, and the tanagers too. So yeah, that's just a quick overview of passeriform diversity. Yes, that was quick and simplified. Um, and yeah, I think, if passeriforms had been the only bird group to make it to modern day, like we would still consider birds to be an incredibly successful group of
Oh yeah.
animals, right? Yeah, like again, like the species are, of passeriforms alone equal or exceed the species of mammal that are alive today. Um, and so I think they are an excellent kind of symbol of how successful dinosaurs have been in our Cenozoic world. And truly, they are, in a very literal sense, the sound of a new dawn, because what is the morning chorus composed of? It's composed of the songs of passeriform birds primarily. Um, they have, made their way into our popular consciousness and have inspired art and creativity in humans for millennia. So, yeah, absolutely remarkable radiation of little singing dinosaurs. What do you think?
No, I definitely agree. There's certainly an aspect of nature that should be very much appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
Um, this might be kind of a weird reference, but I'm reminded of the Emperor and the Nightingale,
Hmm.
the Hans Christian Andersen story about how there's appreciation in the simpler things in life.
Right.
You have, for example, like in the story, of course, you have like the mechanical, amazing, spectacular bird that can sing all kinds of songs and do all kinds of tricks and stuff. And then you have just the humble little brown bird that just kind of sings its little song, and that's all it really does.
Right.
And like end of the day, like that is probably more special and appreciative than something extravagant that
Hmm.
is maybe a little bit more artificial.
Right. Right.
I guess to be a little bit philosophical, I think about what humans have done with music
Mm-hmm.
and how as far as like vocalization, like obviously like we are a species with a very complex language, including syntax, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and we've been able to craft these wonderful songs and incorporate that along with more instrumental pieces, our musical instruments, for example, to create some really wonderful stuff, all including symphonies and whatnot. And then you just think about like songbirds, for example, where you just have like this complex adjustment of the shrinks,
Yep.
and you get equally amazing and spectacular and complex songs
Yeah.
and music. And it's just an interesting parallel to think about that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, yeah, I definitely don't think it is an accident that uh, songbirds have inspired musical talent in humans as well, because we definitely see the parallels there and have recognized it for a long time.
Oh yeah, and it's like you have to wonder like the history of music, like
Hmm.
going to the very beginning. We don't have anything
Yeah,
definitive about where music in humans began, I guess
right,
to put it bluntly. Some of the oldest instruments that we found that were confident are instruments and are not like
hmm.
bones that have been gnawed on by
Right.
hyenas and something like that, are woodwind or
Hmm.
flutes and things. And part of me wonders how that may have come about.
Right.
You know, did like early humans hear songbirds and try to find a way to mimic those sounds?
Hmm.
Is there that connection there? We
Right.
don't know, but it's certainly something that's kind of fun to think about.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I definitely agree there. Um, Alrighty, so that ends our overview of bird diversity, but I do have a little bit of some end matter to close off the series on. Um, yeah, the next slide, I guess, it was kind of a review of what we've covered in this series. So we have looked at the origin of crowned birds from their non-bird dinosaur ancestors. We talked about how crowned birds, modern type birds, probably originated in the latest Cretaceous, and at least three different groups survived the Great Asteroid impact that killed off all of the other dinosaurs. So at least three. Some scientists will say probably a lot more than that. I would say a few more than that. But in any case, they made it through when the other dinosaurs did not. And then among the crowned birds, we split on one end to the paleognathe birds, which have spawned a lot of different large flightless forms like the ostriches and the emus and such, and most remarkably, I think, have done that many, many times as we discussed. And then in the rest of the birds, the neonates, we split into, on one hand, the gallo-ansarans, the ducks and the chickens and their relatives, which have, occupied a wide variety of niches and have become very important to us in our human cultures. And then all the other birds are neo-aves. We talked about how the relationships with the neo-aves have been really hard to tease out and still an ongoing problem, and we're trying to, you know, get to the bottom of. But for the moment, we still do not have a very clear picture of how all the major lineages of neo-avians are related to each other. And that was episode 4, talking about this impossible knot to untangle. Now, one of the major groups of neo-avians we covered in episode 5, and that was the strysores, the nightjars, and potus, and frogmouths, and swifts, and hummingbirds. They all form a absolutely remarkable group full of extreme adaptations. Definitely one of my favorite groups of birds. I'm totally not biased because I did a lot of research on this group, but I mean, I think even if you haven't, you would have to agree that things like swifts and hummingbirds are just amazing organisms.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
yeah, and then we looked at the gruiform birds, the cranes and rails and their relatives, and how many other groups of birds were once considered their kin as well, but have now been scattered to different parts of the bird phylogeny. But what's still left in there still has a lot to tell us about bird evolution, and so they have some quite special adaptations there. We also used episode 6 to kind of tie up a loose end, and that was the hoatzin, which is only known from one living species, and we still have no idea whatsoever what kind of bird it is, other than the fact that it's a neo-avian. But yeah, weird bird. Still trying to get to the bottom of that mystery. And then episode 7, we had the shorebirds, which actually have adapted to many more environments beyond just the shores. And so that's a really a diverse group. We looked at the big water bird radiation in episodes 8 and 9. We looked at birds that spend most of their time over or in the water, like the tropic birds and the loons and the penguins and their kin. And then also their big radiation in the pelicanomorphs, where they start adapting to other types of aquatic environments as well, from fresh waters to the coasts. We looked at the raptorial members of teleravians, or some of them at least, in episode 10. We looked at the hawks and eagles and the owls, kind of the diurnal and nocturnal counterparts to one another, and how they have become very successful and effective hunters in their ecosystems, which are pretty much everywhere in the world. We looked at 3 groups of birds that don't get a lot of press within teleravies, the mouse birds, the kurils, and the trogons, and how they used to be much more diverse in the ancient past, and what that tells us about how climate can change our world. And then we looked at members of Picocoraceae, the kingfishers and woodpeckers and hornbills and toucans and such, and how they have adapted to a lot of weird niches and have all these strange adaptations in episode 12. In episode 13, we looked at the Seriemas, and their long extinct terrifying relatives, the terror birds, and how they used to dominate as apex predators in many parts of the world, particularly the Americas. And then in episode 14, we look at the falcons and the parrots and each of their unusual strategies for survival. We talked a lot about also avian intelligence and how that evolved. And then finally, in our current finale episode, we meet 60% of all living birds today, the passeriform birds, and what a wonderful diversity that is. So yeah, as you can see, the story of dinosaurs, their second chapter, uh, it's a sprawling one and very extensive one. It definitely is not one that ends with "oh, and then there were birds and that's it." It is, yeah, it's a story that has taken us many hours to tell, and it's not the end of the story yet. So as we shall see on the next slide, birds are still around, birds are still with us, and birds are impacted by our activities, and actually vice versa. So the story of the dinosaurs hasn't ended just yet, even though the series is coming to a close. So finally, I would like to address, anthropogenic threats to birds. Like we already talked quite a bit about the biodiversity crisis in the finale of Humanity, a prologue. But so I won't go into too much detail about all of those things here. But I do want to highlight the fact that a lot of birds have not been spared from a lot of these crises. Over 1,400 species of the world's birds are considered under threat of global extinction, and that's about 13% of all bird species alive today. And that might be an underestimate because a lot of the time we don't know when certain species are in trouble. It takes people actually doing the research to figure that out. Sometimes species are declining faster than we thought, and sometimes the International Union for the Conservation of Nature that kind of determines how threatened species are. They can be pretty conservative when it comes to deciding if something is extinct or not. Like they'll pretty much only give the extinct status to like recently extinct species that we are pretty damn sure are extinct. And that's because if we declare something extinct when it actually isn't, it can become a lot harder to gain protection for that species if we discover, oh, wait, actually, it's still around and we need to protect it. So definitely a substantial portion of the world's bird species are under threat. And the IUCN also lists like over 150 bird species as being recently extinct. They consider 1,500 the cutoff mark. But as we've seen throughout the series, there have been many species of birds that may or may not have died out before that time that were probably also driven to extinction by humans. So yeah, if we include all of those, and the kind of death toll there is remarkable. So yeah, birds are under threat from human activities. I will stress that unless the Earth becomes like absolutely uninhabitable for large animals, it is likely that at least some birds will probably survive. We do know, of course, like there are plenty of bird species that do pretty well in like human created environments. So chances are, it is pretty likely that at least some bird species will survive. We already saw that the crowned birds survived through the great end Cretaceous mass extinction, and we're not quite at the extinction rate that caused there. However, it would nonetheless be a much diminished world, and we would lose a lot of bird diversity and, of course, other organisms as well, many of which have very long and distinctive evolutionary histories and are unique representatives of like particular phylogenetic positions or lifestyles or behaviors. And so it is certainly in our best interest for understanding the universe and giving our descendants more of the world's riches to appreciate that we conserve as many species as possible. And of course, birds do provide us with practical benefits as well. And I don't really like to think of like natural resources in terms of practical benefits because that sounds like, oh yeah, the world is made for us, which of course
Yeah.
is a very anthropogenic and arrogant perspective. But nonetheless, it is often easier to convince people to care about things if you can tell them that there are tangible benefits to conserving some of these things. And so, yeah, birds definitely provide us with um, direct benefits. Like we talked about the importance of vultures, for example, how they clean up carcasses and how that helps limit disease and the spread of like things like feral dogs, for example. So in places where vulture populations are greatly diminished, like there are a lot of public health concerns as a consequence. The birds are major predators in their ecosystems. They prey on a lot of insects and rodents that can cause us trouble. There was a pretty recent article I read on the Cornell Lab of Ornithology website where I talked about how basically providing habitat for insect-eating birds can provide like pretty much more effective, as effective or more effective pest control than using many kinds of pesticides on like in an agricultural setting. Um, so so yeah, it would do us well to find ways to coexist with nature like that, especially when they bring us benefits such magnitude. Birds are also seed dispersers. A lot of plants rely on birds to disperse their seeds and pollinate as well. And like sure, maybe we could develop ways of doing that ourselves, but it would definitely be a big conservation of resources and money and time and effort if we just let nature continue doing its thing that it's already been doing, right? So yeah, and of course, birds also provide us with lots of aesthetic benefits. People have admired birds for a long time for many reasons: their appearances, their songs, their gift of flight, and I think having birds around with us will continue to inspire us to do all the amazing things that we do. And so that yet again is another reason that it is in our best interest to conserve bird diversity around the world. Now, briefly, some major anthropogenic threats to birds today. Habitat destruction is one of the biggest ones, especially the clearing of forests for like agriculture. Not only forests too. Of course, the popular perception of like habitat destruction is the forests getting cut down, and that's of course a concern for many kinds of birds and other animals. But places like grasslands, for example, all the native grasslands in North America are major habitats for birds, but they are under threat because of similar reasons. Basically, a lot of the native plants are getting cleared out for the purposes of agriculture or ranching. And of course, the cleared out land does not provide a suitable habitat for the animals that originally lived there, or at least for most of them. And that's definitely a major concern as well. Grassland birds are under major threat in North America. And then there's a whole, the general concept of like cutting up habitats into islands by human development. Like even if we're not like destroying very much of the habitat itself by like area, if we like make cuts through the habitat by paving roads, for example, then that kind of divides up the habitats and prevents the animals from spreading from place to place, and that can limit their population growth and such. And again, rarity is kind of the pathway to extinction, and so dividing things up into islands is one of the most surefire ways of causing extinctions. Yeah, so that's definitely a big concern, and so people are definitely concerned about like connectivity of habitats as well. Like make sure the animals are able to get from place to place to where they need to go, and to make sure that there's enough kind of diversity there to exchange genes and such and build up their population. Like pretty much everything else on Earth today, birds are affected by climate change. Climate change kind of ties into the habitat destruction aspect of things because the climate is going to change like which habitats are found where, and that's of course not so good news for some birds, which might have to move or have their habitats basically destroyed. Invasive species are a huge problem for many birds, especially on island environments. We talked about the avian malaria being spread by mosquitoes on Hawaii, but also things like rats are a major issue on many islands. People accidentally introduce rats or mice onto islands, and they are major nest predators of birds. So they start eating up all the baby birds and eggs, and sometimes even the adult birds too, which is not a pretty sight. A major invasive species, unfortunately, are cats. So feral cats and outdoor cats kill a lot of native wildlife in ecosystems all over the world. And direct hunting and trapping by humans is also of concern. I do want to stress that yes, I do know that many hunters are ardent conservationists and some of the biggest advocates of conservation. However, it is nonetheless undeniable that unsustainable harvesting of some bird species is a big threat to their survival at the moment in some parts of the world. For example, a lot of tropical birds, a lot of songbirds and parrots are being caught for the pet trade in unsustainable numbers and treated very poorly in market conditions. And many of them are threatened because of that. Birds also often fly into human-made structures, which can be frequently fatal. Birds often fly into windows. That's a kind of well-known example. There's this idea that birds can't see glass, and I mean that's technically true, but the thing is that that's not really what causes them to fly into windows in itself, because we can't really see glass either, right? That's why glass looks transparent to us, and certainly, I think some people probably have had incidents where they have overlooked glass doors or panels and just walked into them. Yeah, but different, right? But the difference is, we know how to recognize glass when it's there. Like we know how to spot the reflections and such. And of course, even if we do walk into a glass panel occasionally, we're usually not moving at fast enough speeds to cause like serious damage to ourselves, whereas a bird flying at high speed and doesn't recognize the window there at all and just that can be deadly. And a lot of time the reason that they fly into windows is that because they see the reflection of the surrounding environment being reflected off the window, and so they think that there's more space to go there, but then boom. And so yeah, that can be a pretty big issue. And at night as well, because it turns out that a lot of birds actually migrate at night, and they appear to use the stars for navigation in part. And so when people keep their lights on at night, they can often mislead the birds into thinking, oh, that's just the night sky, and then they crash into the giant skyscraper and kill themselves. Yeah, so that's also quite unfortunate, and of course, pollution is a big issue, and the introduction of various toxins into the environment. We've talked about pesticide use on the show before, and how that threatens birds. Also, plastic as well. That's a big threat, especially to seabirds, since because of marine plastic pollution, a lot of the birds end up picking up the plastic and eating it or feeding it to their young, and of course, plastic doesn't provide any nutrition. So, yeah, that's not a good combination. So yeah, just some of the major threats to birds today, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means. So, what can we do as individuals? Well, on the next slide, I give some suggestions, and if you want to, learn more about ways you can help birds in detail, there are a lot of great conservation organizations that have major web presences where they give advice. So places like the Audubon Society and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And they all provide some pretty useful tips. Unfortunately, those are pretty North American centric organizations. They're primarily focused on North American birds, but still, if you want to help birds, get to know the species in your area and go out and look at birds. And we can't care about what we don't know about, right? So I think the more we get out there and understand what is actually out there, I think the more appreciation we will grow to have for it. So I think that's definitely one of the most important things you can do. But I guess in terms of more specific suggestions, here are some. You can try to maintain a relatively bird-friendly residence, your house and yard. And the ways you can do this is you can grow native plants. So find out what plants are native to your area. Oftentimes, birds birds will be dependent on those plants, like as nest sites or as food sources, and that's a very good option to help birds and provide them with suitable habitat. There's of course also bird feeders, but bird feeders can be kind of controversial. So the thing is, like, it is true, bird feeders can be a good way to attract birds to your home, and it can be a good way for you to observe birds and learn about them, and it can help them out when food is scarce in the wild. But the thing is, like, unless you maintain these bird feeders like very regularly and keep them clean, they can also be a pretty good place for disease to spread, and that's certainly not good for wild birds if disease spreads widely among them. And so, yeah, that's something to look out for. I think I would say probably most bird researchers are okay with bird feeding, but yeah, you have to be careful with that. And the thing is, not all birds feed on the food that we provide in bird feeders either. So I think by growing native plants, we're also providing water sources as well. Pretty much most birds need to drink, even if they don't eat seeds. You can probably attract a greater variety of birds to your area. And then there's keeping cats indoors. Like, yeah, I mentioned this in the last slide about how cats are a major threat to a lot of native wildlife, and it is true. It is undeniably true. The numbers do not lie. And I kind of hate talking about this subject because it always sparks so much drama. I know in several times in recently I already saw like this kind of blow up on Twitter in my corner of the internet. The huge discourse just going on about like outdoor cats and versus like birds and stuff like that. So yeah, I kind of hate talking about it, but it is important. So I am going to spend a bit of time here to talk about it. So it is a real threat, and some people might say, well, oh, I never see my cat bring back dead animals, so clearly they're not hunting. But unless you're monitoring the cat like for its entire time while it's outside, it's very hard to be sure of that. Um, like people have done studies about what cats are up to when they go outside, and yeah, a lot of the time they can be killing a lot of things without the knowledge of the owner. Um, and then there's a common I guess argument that is basically that oh well, the cat is just doing what cats do. Like there are a lot of predators out there that kill birds, and yes, there are a lot of predators that kill birds, and yes, it is natural for cats to want to hunt things, but the thing is that domestic cats do not belong in any wild ecosystem. They're like a domestic species that is cultivated by humans, as it were. So you're basically adding like predation pressure on top of like the original wildlife predators that there already are on the bird population, and that is not great for the wildlife. Furthermore, because cats get fed by humans, that means they can spend all their time outdoors hunting if they want to. Like a typical predator, and I know there are exceptions, but this is generalization. A typical predator, it hunts and then it stops because it doesn't want to waste energy. It doesn't know when its next meal is going to be, so it hunts until it's full, and then once it has a square meal, it doesn't go hunting anymore until it has to. But a cat, because it is being well fed by humans, it can go out and hunt just for the fun of it if it wants to, and it can keep killing and killing and killing if it feels like it. And of course, that can rack up a death toll pretty damn quickly. And then another argument is that, well, there are other things that kill birds that humans do. It's the fault of the humans. Don't blame the cats. So why are you so fixated on this one thing? And it's like, yeah, it is true that humans do a lot of things to kill birds, like I mentioned in the previous slide. But this is one that is pretty easily preventable and is also not insignificant. Like the numbers that have been documented of how many, native wildlife species cats kill in North America, in Australia, and recently there was a study that was done in China on the subject, suggests that cats annually kill billions with a B, native wildlife individuals, like every year. Um, so it is not an insignificant force, and in fact, it is probably one of the biggest sources of human-caused mortality for wild birds. So yeah, and however, it is something we can easily prevent by keeping cats indoors. Or, I'm not saying that you can't ever let your cat outside, but if you do, like, maybe supervise it in a particular area of the yard. Or I know some cats can be trained to walk on harnesses or leashes. That can be a good way to give them some outdoor time. Or building them what they call a catio, so a little sort of like an enclosure, but it's outdoors, and so it gives them the chance to be out in the sunshine and be out with the plants and stuff, but contained in an area where they won't be causing too much damage to the local ecosystem. And even if you don't care about native wildlife, even if you don't care about birds, it is better for the cats to not wander around outdoors unsupervised. There are predators out there in many parts of the world that are capable and will kill cats for food. In North America, there are things like coyotes, for example. There are birds, some large birds of prey that are capable of taking cats. They might get into fights with, say, dogs or other cats out there. There are cars. There are people who don't have the best of intentions for cats or animals in general. And there are diseases, and some of these diseases can be transmitted to humans. So, yeah, in the end, it's kind of the owner's choice as to what to do, and what kind of values they prioritize. But I think that when we have pets, we have a responsibility to ensure their well-being and to make sure that they don't inconvenience others, including native wildlife species. Yeah, I know. Joan, your family has a cat, don't they? What do you do with them?
Yeah, well, it's my sister Gabby's cat, Barb's. Well, she is kept primarily indoors,
Mm-hmm.
because it's kind of one of those things that kind of worked out on its own.
Right.
One of Gabby's old apartments had like a big front yard that went into like a pond, and
Hmm.
there were geese that would like hang around there, right?
Yeah.
And so Gabby was curious one day, like opening the door, what would Barbara do? And so Barbara kind of looks around and like takes a few steps, and then this goose just walks up and makes a as geese do, makes a
Right.
big 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 call, and then Barbara of course runs inside, and
Well.
now she won't really go outside that much anymore.
Well, that kind of worked out.
Yeah, but I mean, like she has in the new apartment
Hmm.
in Florida, nice patio with like a big
Oh, nice.
screen window, so Barbara can get out there and get some sun. And
Right. Right.
I mean, she's not like an agile, crazy cat,
Hmm.
so she gets all the exercise that she needs
Hmm.
indoors anyway.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I've made it a point to inform her, and I think she understands completely
Hmm.
that it's better for Barbara in the long run and healthier to
Right.
just keep her inside. And so we've been pretty good about that.
That's good. Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds like you got a pretty good setup there. But yeah, if you're interested in the subject, I have cited a number of papers about the ecological impact of cats and such in the references. So check those out. I will not be engaging in any bad faith arguments in the comments, just so you know. Um,
Hmm.
yeah. So yeah, I've said my piece, and that's what I'm going to say about it. And I think the evidence points towards a pretty clear position. Um, anyways, other things we can do. Making windows safer for birds, you can consult a lot of those ornithological organizations I mentioned earlier for tips on how to do that. It turns out that kind of putting like a single like silhouette, as people often do, on the windows probably doesn't do that much to keep birds safe, unfortunately. But if you put like these small and closely spaced stickers all over the window,
Hmm.
that seems to be more effective to prevent birds from flying into them. And so if you have a problem with birds constantly crashing into particular windows, that you might want to consider that. And if you live on like major migratory pathways where nocturnal migrants will pass through, turning your lights off at night can also help a lot. course, purchasing sustainable products and reducing your plastic use, that's something that is definitely good for natural environments in general and can potentially help birds. You can go out and look at birds and record your observations for citizen science projects to help us learn more about population trends and the abundance of birds. There's a website called eBird that you can use to record bird sightings. Like if you see a bird someday, you can just go onto the website and just say, oh, I saw this species and this species and this species, and you can keep a list for yourself. So it's kind of fun because you can kind of keep records for your own purposes, but those data that you provide will also be available to like researchers, and they can use that to conduct research projects, which is very cool. And at broader scales, I think some of the most important things we can do is support conservation organizations, like follow them on social media and donate money to them if you can. Join them and maybe participate in their activities if you're interested in doing that. Because conservation organizations, of course, have had a long history of lobbying for change, and they're definitely the ones who are at the forefront of doing a lot of this conservation work, and of course voting for politicians who are likely to support environmentally friendly, or I say bird friendly here to be specific, but of course birds don't usually come up specifically, but nonetheless politicians who are likely to support policies that will help birds, try to vote for them if you can. Alrighty, so on the next slide, finally, we're getting very close to the end now. If you like this series, maybe you're wondering, what are some other resources I can turn to learn more about the subjects that you talk about? And something that's kind of unfortunate is that part of the reason I decided to do this series is precisely because there aren't many resources about like the Cenozoic fossil record of birds or the evolution of birds in the Cenozoic through deep time. However, there are a few books that I do recommend that do touch on this subject. So the first of all is Gerald Meyer's book. Gerald Meyer is one of the leading bird paleontologists alive today, called Avian Evolution. Now, this is a somewhat semi-technical reference book, so you can think about it as sort of like a college textbook, I guess, on this particular subject about avian evolution. It does go into like all the different bird groups and their fossil records and such. And in fact, I've repeatedly consulted this book because this book has been pretty much my main reference while putting this series together. So if you want to do like a somewhat deep dive into the subject, then this is a good one. But yeah, it is semi-technical, so if you want a more kind of general audience book, then probably not this one. Extinct Birds by Julian Hume, who is a leading researcher on recently extinct birds and also an amazing artist as well. He has drawn a lot of these birds. This is basically a book that contains information on pretty much all the known species of recently extinct birds, birds that died out in historical times. And so it is an excellent reference for recently extinct species of birds, and I also recommend that. Now, Where Song Began by Tim Lowe, I've mentioned a few times on the show already. It is a more general audience book, I think, and I think if you're looking for a more general audience book, this is one of my top recommendations for not just bird evolution, but evolutionary biology in general. It talks about the evolution of Australia's birds and basically kind of what forces might have caused Australian birds to evolve the way they did, and how Australia's birds ended up influencing other ecosystems around the world, because as we said earlier, the songbirds, for example, dispersed out of Australia and are now present in pretty much all terrestrial ecosystems. So yeah, it's a really good book, and it touches on many different subjects, not just like evolution, but also things like how social prejudices can influence scientific research. I kind of touched on that earlier, and things like bird conservation and things. So yeah, it's an excellent read. I like it a lot. The Ascent of Birds by John Riley is a book that I think in spirit is pretty similar to this series. And so what it does is it kind of goes through the diversity of birds. But it doesn't cover like every group of birds in detail. But what it does is that it uses particular types of birds as case studies to explain some aspect of evolutionary biology. So if you've read the Ancestor's Tale by Richard Dawkins, it's kind of similar in spirit to that. And in fact, the author does say that he was inspired by the Ancestor's Tale in writing The Ascent of Birds. Yeah, so for example, like he talks about crows, for example, when he's talking about the evolution of intelligence, and then he ties that together. And he talks about white eyes and their great speciation tendencies, and of birds of paradise and sexual selection and things like that. So yeah, it's a pretty good read as well. Now, the author is not an ornithologist. He is a pretty experienced birder. I do think that some of the information in the book is outdated. Like, I mean, that's inevitable, but I mean, like, it has become outdated like very shortly after its publication. I would keep that in mind when reading it, but nonetheless, I have a more detailed review of it on my blog, so I'll probably link that in the description. I think overall it is a very good introduction to like bird diversity and kind of major concepts in evolutionary biology, using birds as examples of those. Okay, last slide. These are all the new bird species that have been named crown birds, so no stem birds, crown birds, since this series started. So August 26th was the date when the first episode of Dinosaurs, the second chapter, was released in 2020. And so these are all the species of birds, mostly extinct birds, as you can see, but also some living bird species as well, that have been newly named since then. And in some cases, I've actually been able to work some of these species into the series. For example, Aviraptor, I mentioned in the kind of Passeriform episode. But some of these are came out too late to be fit into their respective episodes that they would fit into, and so I would like to cover them in an updates episode later. And I do want to stress that not naming new species is not the end all and be all of scientific research. There's lots of really important research that does not name any new species at all. But I think seeing this list of species gives you a sense of like how quickly the field moves. Like we're still discovering like many new species of fossil birds, and we're still discovering some new species of living birds too. So yeah, the field moves quickly, and there's a lot to say. It's not as big of a field. Like the study of like fossil birds certainly is not as big of a field as say paleoanthropology, but there is still constantly new information coming out, and so I would like to do an updates episode to cover those. Now, if you're wondering, birds are very well studied in the modern day, and so we probably documented most of the bird species that are out there to be documented. Many of the new bird species are like kind of quote unquote new, that we find in terms of like extant birds. Basically, a lot of time it's like people do genetic analyses and they say, oh, actually these two species that we thought were the same are actually pretty genetically distinct, so we should probably consider them different species, and they name a new one for one of the species, and people don't always agree on whether that's justified or not. So yeah, that can be a bit controversial, but even if you don't count those, we actually are still describing like species of birds that are new to science, that have not been described before, and in fact a few of them have already been described this year. So yeah, there is still plenty for us to learn, and describing new species really is just the first step in finding out that a species exists is just the first step in understanding it, and so there is a lot for us to learn regarding these dinosaurs that we live alongside. So, yeah, that's pretty much the end of Dinosaurs, the second chapter. It's been great. I've always wanted to do kind of a sort of series like this, and I've really elated that I've been able to do so. And so the story of the dinosaurs continues in present day. We are part of their story now, and they are part of our story, and kind of what happens next is it's in part up to us. It's up to us to write this third chapter of the dinosaur story and the next chapter of ours. So if you enjoy this show, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Yeah, you can get the opportunity to get shout outs from us on the episode, or give episode suggestions for us on what to cover. And I believe we currently have one patron who is of a high enough tier to be given a shout out on the episode, and that's Joan's sister Julie. Is that right?
That's right.
So yeah, thanks for your support, and we really appreciate it a lot. As always, Henry provided the theme music for our show, and my friend Alicia came up with the color scheme for my Alvarez or avatar, so thanks to them. And our friend Chris provided some of the photos that I used in this episode, so as I mentioned earlier. And please follow us on Twitter for updates. We will tweet whenever we release new episodes. You can also subscribe to us directly on the YouTube channel that you're probably listening to this on. And yeah, you'll be notified when we release new episodes. If you have questions about the show, and remember, we are specifically taking questions for our 1-year anniversary episode before August 20th, you can email us or leave a comment down below. And of course, as always, I have links to references for the episode in the description. So next time, it will be the special 1-year anniversary episodes where all your questions will be answered, or at least in as much as we decide to answer them. And then we'll do a bit of I guess novel gazing about how far we've come and all that stuff. So tune in if you're interested in that. And with that, I think that's the end here. At some point, I will release an updates episode, but I don't want to commit to a time yet for Dinosaurs: The Second Chapter. But for now, this is the end of Dinosaurs: The Second Chapter, and I hope you enjoyed it and learned some things from it. And please take care and stay safe, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us, and I've certainly appreciated this too. And till next time.
Have a good one, everybody.
I'm your only friend, I'm not your only friend, but I'm a little glowing friend, but really I'm not actually your friend, but I am. Blue canary in the attic by the light switch, who watches over you? Make a little birdhouse in your soul, not to put too fine a point on it, say I'm the only bee in your bonnet. Make a little birdhouse in your soul. I have a secret to tell from my electrical well. It's a simple message and I'm leaving out the whistles and bells, so the room must listen to me, filibuster vigilantly. My name is Blue Canary, one note spelled L-I-T-E. My story's infinite, like a longing symphony, it doesn't rest. Blue Canary in the attic by the light switch, who watches over you? Make a little birdhouse in your soul, not to put too fine a point on it, say I'm the only bee in your bonnet. Make a little birdhouse in your soul. I'm your only friend, I'm not your only friend, but I'm a little glowing friend, but really I'm not actually your friend, but I am. Well, there's a picture opposite me of my primitive ancestry, who stood on rocky shores and kept the beaches shipwreck-free. Though I respect that a lot, I'd be fired if that were my job, after killing Jason off and countless screaming Argonauts. Bluebird of friendliness, like guardian angels, it's always near. Blue canary in the attic by the light switch, who watches over you? Make a little birdhouse in your soul, not to put too fine a point on it, say I'm the only bee in your bonnet. Make a little birdhouse in your soul, and while you're at it, leave a night light on inside the birdhouse in your soul. Not to put too fine a point on it, say I'm the only bee in your bonnet. Make a little birdhouse in your soul, blue canary in the attic by the light switch, who watches over you? Make a little birdhouse in your soul, not to put too fine a point on it, say I'm the only bee in your bonnet. Make a little birdhouse in your soul, and while you're at it, leave a night light on inside the birdhouse in your soul. Not to put too fine a point on it, say I'm the only bee in your bonnet. Make a little birdhouse in your soul.